When we think of the Roman Empire, we often picture grand architecture, sophisticated roads, shining marble statues, and a society that gave us democracy, law, and engineering marvels that still influence us today. But behind the glimmer of its golden age lay a darker, more sinister truth. Rome was not just a city of learning, civilization, and order. It was also a machine built on blood, cruelty, and the relentless pursuit of power. The shadows of Rome are deep and long, and in them we find stories of suffering, oppression, and horrors that history rarely highlights. At the very core of Roman society was a brutal class system that thrived on inequality. While senators and wealthy landowners reclined in opulence, sipping wine in their villa gardens, the vast majority of Rome's population lived in poverty, crammed into overcrowded insulae, apartment buildings that were often structurally unsound and constantly at risk of fire. The rich bathed in warm water and discussed philosophy. The poor struggled for bread, relying on the government's grain dole just to survive. For all its technological brilliance, Rome remained a society where human worth was defined by wealth, birth, and usefulness to the state. Slavery was the backbone of the empire. An estimated one-third of the population were slaves, stolen from conquered lands, sold in markets like livestock, and treated as tools to be used and discarded. They built the temples, served the patricians, educated Roman children, and fought, and died, in the gladiator arenas for public amusement. Rome's grandeur was not paid for in gold alone, but in human lives. Slaves had no legal personhood. They could be beaten, raped, or even killed without legal consequence. And the worst irony? Some of the most educated and skilled individuals, doctors, philosophers, poets, were themselves slaves, serving a society that denied them basic human dignity. The Roman appetite for spectacle and violence was insatiable. The Colosseum, a marvel of ancient architecture, was a blood-soaked theater of cruelty. Thousands of gladiators fought and died for sport. Some of them trained warriors, others condemned criminals or enslaved captives forced into combat for the pleasure of a roaring crowd. Executions were common, and they weren't always swift or merciful. Crucifixion, famously used on Spartacus's followers and even on Jesus of Nazareth, was a favored method for punishing rebels and slaves. It was slow, excruciating, and deliberately public, an agonizing warning to anyone who dared to defy the empire. And then there were the Roman emperors. History often remembers them as powerful visionaries or madmen, but few grasped the terrifying control they wielded over life and death. Some, like Nero, are infamous for their cruelty, allegedly watching Rome burn while playing his lyre, then blaming the Christians and unleashing one of the first empire-wide persecutions against them. Christians were tortured, torn apart by animals, and burned alive to light imperial gardens. Caligula, another emperor shrouded in infamy, is said to have indulged in incest, sadism, and outright madness, reportedly turning the imperial palace into a brothel and declaring his horse a consul. The Senate, while once a symbol of republican virtue, devolved into a tool for imperial power and corruption. Political dissent was dangerous. To speak out against the emperor or powerful elites could mean exile, forced suicide, or assassination. Many senators lived in fear, caught in a deadly game of alliances, betrayal, and whispered conspiracies. Rome's famed Pax Romana, the so-called Roman peace, was kept not through harmony, but through military dominance and suppression of opposition. Roman conquest was as ruthless as it was efficient. When Rome set its sights on a region, resistance often meant annihilation. Cities that defied Rome were razed, their populations enslaved or slaughtered. Carthage, once a proud rival, was utterly destroyed. Its buildings were flattened, its people massacred, and legend has it the Romans salted the earth to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. Whether this part is myth or truth, it underscores the psychological warfare Rome waged along with its legions. Rome also manipulated religion for control. Though the empire was initially tolerant of various gods and cults, This tolerance extended only as far as loyalty to Rome itself. Religious movements seen as threats to Roman unity were quickly and harshly suppressed. The early Christians refused to worship the emperor as divine, a small act of rebellion that provoked immense cruelty. The empire saw their monotheism not as a religious choice, but as sedition. Temples were burned, texts destroyed, and martyrs made in the blood-soaked arenas. And when Christianity eventually became the state religion, it didn't bring peace. It brought its own kind of persecution against pagans, Jews, and dissenters. Gender inequality was another glaring cruelty embedded into the fabric of Roman life. Women, regardless of class, were subject to male authority. A father could disown, imprison, or even execute his daughter if she disgraced the family. Women were denied political rights and legal independence. Their bodies and lives were often pawns in the political games of marriage alliances, and their worth was judged by chastity, obedience, and fertility. Even women of the imperial family, such as Agrippina or Julia, were not safe from political manipulation or violence, often discarded, poisoned, or exiled once they outlived their usefulness. Even Roman leisure was built on the suffering of others. Public baths, circuses, and feasts were tools of distraction, a kind of bread and circuses policy meant to pacify the masses and prevent revolt. Gladiator games, animal hunts, and naval battles staged in flooded arenas became regular spectacles. Exotic animals were imported at enormous cost, not for conservation or admiration, but to be slaughtered for amusement. Lions, elephants, crocodiles, and even giraffes met brutal fates, all to remind Rome's citizens of their dominion over nature and other peoples. And yet, for all this darkness, the system endured. It endured because it offered just enough comfort, just enough progress, and just enough beauty to keep the illusion alive. But beneath the surface, the cracks were growing. Inequality deepened. Corruption flourished. Armies became more loyal to their generals than to Rome itself. The very tools of conquest and control that once expanded the empire would later be turned inward, as civil wars erupted and emperors rose and fell in quick succession. Rome's fall, when it came, was not a single moment, but a slow unraveling of centuries of contradictions. The very roads that brought wealth also brought invaders. The same wealth that filled the empire's coffers also bred decadence and rot. And the brutality that once enforced Rome's rule became its greatest weakness, as oppressed peoples rose up and the borders of empire dissolved into chaos. But perhaps the darkest legacy of the Roman Empire is not just what it did in its own time, but what it left behind. Its ideals of conquest, hierarchy, and dominance would echo through history, in colonialism, fascism, and even modern politics. Empires since have looked to Rome not only for inspiration in architecture and law, but in control and propaganda. The image of Rome has been polished and glorified, but its true story of cruelty masked as civilization is one that must be remembered. Because history is not just about what was built, but also about what was broken. It's not only about who conquered, but who suffered. The Roman Empire gave the world many things, but among them, it also gave us a chilling lesson, that greatness without compassion becomes tyranny, and that the darkest shadows are often cast by the brightest lights. The Roman Empire is often remembered for its grandeur. Colossal temples, majestic aqueducts, paved roads stretching across continents, and an administrative system that once governed over 60 million people. But beneath the surface of Roman achievement was a far more unsettling reality. A world where wealth meant everything, freedom was rare, and dignity was a luxury afforded only to the privileged. The Roman Empire did not run on democracy or fairness. It ran on oppression, exploitation, and a system so unequal it would shock even the most cynical modern observer. Let's start with a walk through the heart of Rome. You might see senators in white togas striding proudly toward the Forum, marble columns glistening in the sun. You might see feasts in opulent villas where the elite dine on peacock tongues, dormice dipped in honey, and the finest wines imported from across the empire. But shift your gaze just a few streets over, and you find a very different Rome. Narrow alleys, crumbling tenement buildings, the stench of open sewage, and families huddled in single rooms with rats for company. This was the world of the plebeians, the common people. And it was not the exception. It was the rule. The gap between the rich and the poor was enormous and growing. A handful of aristocrats controlled the majority of the empire's land and wealth, while the masses labored endlessly, struggling just to survive. Many worked as day laborers or craftsmen, paid poorly and forced to compete for what little food the empire distributed. The grain dole, the monthly handout of wheat to the poorest citizens, wasn't generosity. It was a strategy to pacify a starving and angry underclass. It was the Roman version of damage control, not compassion. The living conditions were nothing short of brutal. Most Romans lived in insulae, apartment blocks often hastily and poorly constructed by greedy landlords. These multi-story structures were fire traps, built of wood and cheap materials, constantly at risk of collapsing or going up in flames. Entire families shared single rooms with no plumbing, no ventilation, and no privacy. The wealthier citizens, meanwhile, lived in domus, lavish homes with courtyards, fountains, mosaic floors, and running water. The difference between these two worlds wasn't just architectural, it was existential. Slavery was not only accepted in Rome, it was the foundation of its entire economy and culture. Enslaved people made up an estimated 1/3 of the population in Rome at its peak. They were everywhere, in homes, on farms, in the mines, in the streets, in temples, even teaching the children of Roman citizens. These men and women came from conquered lands, abducted during Rome's endless military campaigns, or born into bondage. They were branded like cattle, bought and sold in open markets, and stripped of identity, family, and hope. Imagine being a Greek philosopher, a scholar fluent in literature and science, reduced to tutoring a Roman teenager who saw you as no more than a household fixture. Imagine being forced to mine silver for hours in dark, deadly shafts with no end, no light, no fresh air. Or being trained as a gladiator, knowing your only way out of bondage was likely death in front of thousands cheering for your blood. There were no rights for slaves. If a slave owner was murdered, all slaves in the household could legally be executed in retaliation, even if none had any involvement. Punishments were severe and public. Crucifixions, whippings, branding, mutilations, they were not the exception. They were routine methods of control. Even so-called household slaves who worked in relative comfort lived under constant fear. A single accusation, a single whim from their master, could mean death. Women also suffered in Rome's rigidly patriarchal society. Even upper-class women, often romanticized in modern adaptations, lived under the legal and social dominance of their fathers and husbands. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, and often weren't allowed to own property independently. Their lives were defined by marriage, childbirth, and obedience. For poor women, life was even harder. They worked as vendors, laundresses, or servants, enduring both economic and sexual exploitation with no recourse to law or justice. Children, too, were vulnerable. Poor children often worked from an early age. There were no schools for them, no protections, no childhood. Many were sold into slavery. Even infants weren't safe. The practice of exposure, the abandonment of unwanted babies, was common. Newborns, especially girls or disabled children, were frequently left outside the city walls to die of exposure or to be picked up and sold by slavers. The state did not intervene. The law offered no sanctuary. And while Roman citizens had certain rights, those rights were tightly bound to class. The elite, the patricians and equestrians, had legal privileges that the poor could never dream of. Crimes were punished based on status. A wealthy man might pay a fine for a crime that would earn a poor man a brutal flogging or execution. Justice in the Roman world was not blind. It had a sharp eye for social rank and used its sword accordingly. The military was another structure built on inequality. While Roman citizens of higher status often served in more honorable and less dangerous roles, the burden of the front lines fell on the poor. Many enlisted not out of loyalty or patriotism, but out of desperation, lured by promises of land, citizenship, or a future that almost never materialized. And when the soldiers aged, broken, and injured, they were often discarded, denied pensions, land, or basic care. Their service was transactional, and once the empire had taken what it needed, they were abandoned. Provincial populations, the people of conquered lands, faced another layer of systemic oppression. While Rome boasted of granting citizenship, it was rarely given freely. Non-Roman peoples were taxed heavily, governed by Roman-appointed elites, and often subjected to cultural erasure. Their languages, gods, and traditions were suppressed. Their resources were extracted to fuel the luxury of the capital. Resistance was crushed swiftly and violently, and those who tried to preserve their identity were labeled rebels or barbarians. Rome's tax system was another cruel engine of inequality. Taxes were not just collected, they were exploited. Wealthy collectors called publicani would pay the empire for the right to collect taxes from a region, and then squeeze the population for far more than owed, keeping the difference. It was legalized extortion, and those who couldn't pay often lost everything: their land, their homes, even their freedom. Many families were driven into slavery by debt, not war. Even religion offered little sanctuary. While the Roman pantheon was vast and diverse, the official rituals and priesthoods were dominated by the elite. Festivals and sacrifices were grand affairs that celebrated Rome's dominance and reinforced the existing power structure. The poor watched the processions, but rarely participated meaningfully. The temples were adorned with gold, while many citizens struggled to buy bread. Rome's obsession with appearance and prestige masked its internal rot. Senators wore symbols of power, yet many were corrupt and self-serving, using public office to enrich themselves while ignoring the cries of the people. The emperor himself was treated like a god, while the streets overflowed with beggars and orphans. Bread and circuses, free grain and violent entertainment were not signs of generosity. They were distractions, carefully designed to keep the oppressed masses docile. All the while, Rome projected itself as the beacon of civilization, the bringer of peace, the Pax Romana. But peace, in Rome, meant the absence of resistance, not the presence of justice. It meant silence, not harmony. And those who challenged the system, rebellious slaves, outspoken philosophers, even reform-minded senators, were silenced, exiled, or executed. The inequality of the Roman Empire wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system. It was intentional, institutionalized, and brutally enforced. And though the empire eventually fell, the echoes of its oppression linger. The very laws, architecture, and ideas we inherit from Rome carry with them a darker lineage of exploitation, of class warfare, of people ground into dust to build the illusion of greatness. It's easy to be dazzled by Rome's achievements, but true understanding comes not from marveling at the marble, but from listening to the forgotten voices of those who built it. The laborer who died nameless in a collapsed insula. The slave who taught Latin to Roman children while being denied the right to read for pleasure. The woman sold into a political marriage before she could dream of freedom. The conquered farmer who watched his land become a Roman villa. Their stories are the true foundation of the Roman Empire, and without them, the marble would have crumbled long ago. The Roman Empire is often spoken of as a beacon of civilization, a titan of law, architecture, and order. But behind a mask of marble columns and stately togas lay a different reality, a brutal, violent regime held together not by virtue, but by force. The Roman state was a machine of conquest, cruelty, and authoritarian control, its foundations soaked in blood and its glory maintained by terror. Power in Rome was not earned by kindness or consensus. It was seized, guarded, and sustained through brutality. Every empire has its share of violence, but Rome institutionalized it. Violence was not just a consequence of war, it was a public spectacle, a legal practice, a tool of governance, and a form of entertainment. From the slums of the Subura to the golden halls of the Palatine, cruelty echoed through every layer of Roman society. Take a moment to imagine the Colosseum. It wasn't merely an arena. It was a cathedral of violence. Tens of thousands of spectators, men and women, rich and poor, gathered beneath the awnings to watch death turned into theater. Gladiators, many of them slaves or condemned criminals, were forced to fight for their lives, sometimes against wild beasts, sometimes against each other. These weren't mere sparring matches. They were lethal combats designed to thrill, to distract, to pacify a restless population with the raw spectacle of human suffering. Blood ran so frequently on the sand that it needed to be regularly raked and replaced. Executions were staged during intermissions, prisoners tied to stakes and mauled by animals, or forced to reenact myths in which they were burned, drowned, or torn apart. The crowd roared not in horror, but in delight. Children sat beside their parents and watched men die as casually as today's audience watches action movies. This was entertainment in Rome. Death was normalized. Suffering was a sport. And this bloodlust was not confined to the Colosseum. Rome's justice system was as much about intimidation as it was about law. Public punishments were designed to terrify. Crucifixion, one of Rome's most infamous methods, was a punishment reserved for the lowest of the low, slaves, rebels, and foreigners. It was not meant to kill quickly, but to draw out agony for days. Victims were nailed to wooden crosses and left in the sun to slowly suffocate or die from exposure, infection, or blood loss. Their bodies were left hanging as warnings. It wasn't just execution. It was psychological warfare. Flogging was common and brutal. Roman whips, especially the dreaded flagrum or scourge, were designed to tear flesh, sometimes embedded with bone or metal to increase damage. Disobedient slaves could be beaten to death with impunity. Even Roman citizens, supposedly protected by law, were not safe under imperial rule. A suspicious word, a political misstep, or a rival's betrayal could mean a one-way ticket to the executioner's block. Authoritarianism in Rome wasn't subtle. Power centered around the emperor, who was not just a political leader, but a living god to many. The Senate became a ceremonial body, often powerless, bending to the will of tyrants draped in imperial purple. Some emperors ruled with wisdom, yes, but many more ruled with madness. Take Caligula, for example. He began his reign adored by the people, only to descend into terrifying paranoia and sadism. He executed senators on a whim, slept with his sisters, and reportedly once ordered a man tortured for fun during a dinner party, commanding that the screams not disturb his meal. His reign became so intolerable that his own bodyguards eventually assassinated him. Then there was Nero, the emperor who fancied himself an artist, but became one of history's most feared despots. Under his rule, entire families were purged. He's infamous for allegedly playing music while Rome burned, and when suspicion for the fire fell on him, he shifted blame to the Christians, unleashing one of the first great persecutions. They were torn apart by dogs, burned alive, or crucified, all to divert attention from imperial failure. And if Rome's elite lived in fear, the provinces suffered worse. Rome's might rested on military conquest, and every conquest came with mass violence. Cities that resisted were annihilated, burned to the ground, their populations enslaved or slaughtered. When Rome invaded Gaul, Julius Caesar boasted of killing over 1 million people and enslaving just as many. His victories were celebrated with triumphal marches through Rome, his prisoners paraded in chains before they were executed or thrown into the arena. Rome's rule over its provinces was absolute and often brutal. Governors held near total control over the lives of local populations, and abuses were rampant. They could tax at will, requisition food and property, and punish dissent without trial. Rebellions were met with swift, merciless retaliation. When the Jews of Judea rose against Rome, the response was apocalyptic. In 70 CE, the Roman legions stormed Jerusalem, destroyed the Second Temple, and slaughtered or enslaved hundreds of thousands. Survivors were scattered, their homeland renamed and reshaped in Rome's image. This wasn't peace. This was enforced silence. The so-called Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was not a time of tranquility. It was a time of submission. Rome's version of peace meant obedience to the empire and fear of its retribution. Its legions were not guardians. They were enforcers. They stamped out dissent, put down revolts, and ensured the emperors will stretch from Britannia to Egypt. It was military rule with a thin veneer of civilization. Control extended to the empire's very soul. The emperor's image was everywhere, on coins, in temples, in public squares. Statues of Caesar, Augustus, and their successors were not mere symbols. They were instruments of propaganda. To question the emperor was to question the gods. Worship of the emperor became mandatory, especially in the eastern provinces, where divine kingship was more culturally acceptable. Those who refused were not just considered heretics, they were seen as traitors. Political purges were common. Emperors feared rivals so deeply that exile, imprisonment, or execution became routine tools of governance. Entire families were erased from records and monuments when they fell out of favor. The Senate, once the heart of Roman politics, became a theater of paranoia. Senators committed suicide before being forced to by imperial decree, sometimes on the mere suspicion of treason. And the most dangerous words one could utter were not insults or threats, but truth. There was no freedom of speech in Rome. Writers, philosophers, and historians who criticized the regime were censored, banished, or killed. The philosopher Seneca, once a tutor to Nero, was eventually ordered to take his own life. The historian Tacitus walked a tightrope of political writing, cloaking his critiques in careful language. To tell the truth about Rome was to risk your life. And still, the empire endured. Because fear works. Violence silences. Spectacle distracts. The Roman populace, worn down by hunger and poverty, found escape in the blood of others. The rich, anxious to protect their positions, became complicit in the cruelty. Even the victims sometimes embraced the system, hoping to rise within it rather than be crushed by it. In this way, Rome's authoritarianism didn't just dominate, it infected. But no system built on terror lasts forever. As the centuries passed, the violence that once enforced unity began to tear the empire apart. Emperors were assassinated by their own guards. Armies declared their generals as rival emperors. Civil wars broke out with increasing frequency. The tools of domination turned inward, and Rome began to devour itself. The collapse of Rome was not sudden. It was slow, like the rotting of a great tree. But its downfall was rooted in the same cruelty that built it. Violence, when overused, loses its power. Authority, when abused, breeds revolt. And a society that teaches its people to cheer for blood should not be surprised when they turn on one another. The legacy of Roman violence still echoes. The Colosseum stands today, a crumbling monument to a civilization that wrapped barbarity in elegance. Its ruins attract tourists. Its image adorns postcards. But the screams of the past are still there, if you listen. Rome taught the world how to build, how to govern, how to conquer. But it also taught us how easy it is to mistake fear for order, how quickly entertainment can become cruelty, and how absolute power rarely, if ever, avoids corruption. Behind the glory, behind the grandeur, was a darkness that fueled an empire. And in remembering that darkness, we remember something essential, that the achievements of a civilization mean nothing if they are bought with blood. The Roman Empire did not simply conquer with swords, it conquered minds. Long after the armies marched and the cities fell, Rome's real power came from its mastery of perception, of symbolism, of shaping how people thought and lived. Rome didn't just take land, it rewrote laws, rebuilt temples, renamed gods, and reshaped identities. It knew that fear could silence the body, but belief could capture the soul. And this was where the empire's greatest strength and darkest genius truly lived, in its manipulation of power and its ability to make people not only obey, but internalize their subjugation. From the beginning, Rome understood the power of image. The Roman eagle wasn't just a bird. It was a symbol of absolute dominion. Its standards were carried by legions into every conquered territory. To see it was to be reminded that Rome was watching, that Rome was present, and that Rome could not be resisted. Monuments followed conquest. Temples were raised to Roman gods beside those of the local pantheons. Roads cut through ancient forests and mountains, not just to move armies, but to implant Roman presence deep into the bones of foreign lands. Language was Rome's invisible empire. Latin spread like a tide, washing over native tongues and replacing them not by decree, but by necessity. It became the language of trade, law, administration, and power. In time, conquered peoples began to speak Latin themselves, not because they were forced, but because it became the only way to survive and succeed. In schools, children learned Roman history. They memorized the deeds of Roman heroes. They recited